Welcome everyone, really delighted to be with you today, chairing this session, which we've been brilliantly joined by Will Self, who's going to give us a keynote on really looking at the current culture wars that are going on. I just wanted to say that it's really brilliant to be part of the 2020 Rising Global Peace Forum. As you all know, this year's theme centers around the culture of peace. I suppose recognizing that peace is much more than just the absence of violent conflict. It affects us in so many other ways. And peace is really, in this wider context, around creating and sustaining a better atmosphere for people, communities, and our environment to flourish. And of course, it's about the interconnectedness and interdependence of a whole range of people and actions and movements in terms of how we create this atmosphere of peace. Next year, Coventry will hold the title of UK City of Culture 2021. And as the UK's only city of peace and reconciliation, we will be exploring multiple themes that are absolutely core to our city's identity, including being a city of sanctuary, of hope, of welcome, and of course, a city of peace. And we have promised to use our year in the spotlight to discuss, debate, and celebrate Coventry's identity as a city that moves. And when we talk about Coventry moves, we think about a city that's constantly reinventing itself, embracing many different cultures, innovating in terms of its industrial role, but also putting citizens, activism, and care at the heart of our city's future. So Coventry Moves will really look to promote movements rather than moments. And whilst producing a joyful year-long festival, we also want to ensure it has a strong social conscience, addressing some of the big issues that face modern cities in the 21st century across the UK and globally. And we want to use our year to really talk about our culture and our identity, because it seems that both of these are under attack in public discourse. And so I'm so pleased to be here to introduce Will Self. There is no one better, no one more provocative to talk about whether there is a current war on culture and how it may be won. You will know Will Self as an award-winning author. Obviously, he's a regular columnist, particularly well known for the New Statesman, as well as a professor of modern thought at Brunel University. Will has a distinct perspective on what is happening to our culture and our public discourse. Really enjoying listening to his keynote. The journalist Stuart Maconie once described Will as that rarity in modern cultural life, a genuine intellectual with a bracing command of words and ideas, who is also droll, likable, and culturally savvy. And what I would say to add to that is Will is incredibly self-deprecating. So I'm really looking forward to sharing and listening to Will with you today. So I'm going to hand over to Will Self. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Chenine, and it's a pleasure to be here, albeit virtually. I had been very much looking forward to coming to Coventry, and it's not much of a boast in life, but I feel I've visited just about every British city and large town in my life. The life of a jobbing author and journalist is necessarily peripatetic. But bizarrely, I've never been to Coventry, and it was a real oversight, and I've never seen the cathedral. And I was really looking forward to coming and seeing the cathedral. So it's, I mean, don't get me wrong, within the context of world affairs, my not being able to see Coventry Cathedral ranks pretty low, but it's a source of major disappointment to me. Not least, I think, because the post-war redevelopment of Coventry, and we can start off by talking a bit about, you know, identity at a local level, and I'm sure that concerns Chenine at the moment, given her role. Not least because the post-war identity of Coventry was based so securely on this idea of a phoenix rising from the ashes of the Blitz, of which the defiantly modernist cathedral was a key part, as was considerable urban redevelopment, really in the style of the so-called activators of the post-war period. And this was a period, after all, that gave us 50% of our current and existing housing stock in Britain was built between 1945 and 1976. An extraordinary idea. Here you have a society that is confident enough, that is, you know, a much overused word, is inclusive enough in its thinking to have that objective of, you know, the famous graffito or slogan after the First War was "Homes fit for heroes," and that was carried over to the Second War, where it became "This land for homes at low rent," which was a major plank of Labour's policy in the 1945 election. But let us not forget that the activators of the post-war period were not of one ideological stripe at all. People on the right, people you know, who believed in capitalism tooth and claw, were equally involved in trying to create this land with homes at low rent. And Tory administrations did battle with Labour administrations in the post-war period to see who could build the most houses. Imagine that going on now, governments competing to see who could build the most public housing. Ever since the Thatcher administrations of the from 79 through to the 90s, there's been a almost complete moratorium on social housing building at that level, at that national level. So in some ways, we can see Coventry as a cynosure of this post-war drive for a society that was egalitarian. There was much talk at the time of a kind of reconciliation between Labour and Tory. It was called Buttskillism, the idea that there was a kind of ideological convergence going on in politics. Again, very far removed from our current era. Post-war period, we're a few years away from Rachel Carson's groundbreaking work, Silent Spring, and E.F. Schumacher's Small Society. And we're a long way away from the International Panel on Climate Change's report that led directly to the Kyoto Conference of 1997, and really the beginning of modern widespread awareness of anthropic climate change. So this is a society, the society that built Coventry Cathedral, that has no anxiety about the anthropic effect on the environment. There's no problem. Build fast, build big, don't worry about resources. The earth still presents itself to these people, to the generation, the post-war generation, as limitless. Resources are limitless. People on the left, people who are enthralled to Marxist thinking, never think about the possibility of the exhaustion of the environment. And of course, capitalist society depends on a unstoppable exploitation of resources. Its whole inner logic and dynamism comes from that. I do think, and Chenine adverted to this in her introduction, that we're not in that place anymore. We're in a profoundly different place. Another thing that we need to look back to the 1940s for, and of particular relevance to the Midlands and a bit north of Coventry, more to the Black Country, is the influx of African, Caribbean and South Asian people to Britain to take up jobs. Here again, you have an industry and an economy that is so confident, it's recruiting in the West Indies. It's recruiting in the Punjab. It's asking people positively to come here. I mean, we need to make a distinction between the influx to the mill towns of the north and the influx to industrial jobs in the Midlands. But the fact remains that Britain opens itself out for business, and what it gets is the multiculturalism that we now see around us today. So again, a very different kind of aspiration. No real agonizing about this, an acceptance of a ideology in the background that is intrinsically assimilationist. The assumption is that citizens of or subjects of Her Majesty who live in the empire will necessarily assimilate to the mother country, which represents, and I use the word in its anachronistic sense, it's not me speaking here, to its superior culture. That is a given and an assumption. I'm speaking to you from the Oval in South London. I now live in a majority Black British community here in South London. I live with the great-grandchildren, grandchildren, children of the Windrush generation. And just up the road from me is the deep level shelter built in the London Underground system at Clapham North, which is where a good number of the Windrush generation immigrants were housed when they arrived here in the late 1940s. I kid you not, people who had been asked to come here and to work on London Transport, as it was then called, were housed 200 feet underground in a giant metal tube. So you can get some sense of what the assumptions were, cultural assumptions were at the time. And everybody's familiar with the notion of institutional and systemic racism in the culture at that time. And as indeed, everybody is still familiar with the systemic and institutional racism in the culture today. And, you know, I was asked, I suppose, in a sense, to address the question of multiculturalism, but I'm going to shift sideways on that topic in a characteristic way and come at it slightly differently to the way that perhaps you're expecting. Let me make my credentials clear. I have no time for racism of any kind. I belong to a minority, the Jewish people, who were racialized by the Nazis in order that we could be exterminated. And I don't make that claim of Jewish heritage simply in order to give me skin in the game, perhaps an unfortunate image. I make it because it's a matter of fact. Jewish identity was not racialized before the Holocaust. It's uncomfortable, I think, for a lot of progressive thinkers to realize how intrinsic racism is to the European Enlightenment. David Hume was a racist by modern standards, the greatest Scots philosopher of the Enlightenment. Voltaire was a rabid anti-Semite. Racism was written into the Enlightenment project because the Enlightenment project was necessarily progressive. That was its fundamental sense of itself. It was against superstition. It was against what it would have called idolatry, which it saw in religion, and which it certainly saw in what it would have called, not me, primitive cultures and societies. So it's a big problem for liberals in the West now that the roots of their own ideology defeat their own aspiration to inclusiveness. And I think that that's just one of the origins of the current conflict we have. As I say, let me make it absolutely clear to you. I hold no truck with judging people on the basis of arbitrary qualities that are grouped together under the category of race. Okay? What I do judge people about is the same that everybody judges people about. Of course, we judge people on the basis of the culture they come from. Of course, we judge people on the basis of their ethnicity. The question is, does that judgment form the basis of discriminatory behavior? Does that judgment make you class that person in a different way to yourself or to people who you identify with their culture? That's the problem. The problem of our contemporary culture war is several-fold. One is it's a conflict between two arms of the same ideology that is in bad faith in respect of its own premises. and that's the liberal ideology. So the conflict between what you might call ultra liberals, who emphasize what John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, would have called negative liberties, the liberty not to be interfered with, the ability not to be discriminated against, not to be offended, and what you might think of as the more old school Enlightenment liberals, more likely to be long established in Western Europe, is a liberalism of positive rights, of the rights to do things in society, to assume positions in society, to assume cultural space. This conflict has festered and has become open warfare. But in many cases, I would argue, it's an epiphenomenal conflict to the minorities that these parties claim to speak for. I love the old Irish proverb, it is easy to travel on another man's wound. Or as my late mother would have put it, I cannot listen to arguments based on the high moral ground of other people's suffering. I'm not really interested in hearing that. The fact of the matter is, we've lived in an increasingly inegalitarian society since that massive public building program stopped in the mid-70s. And part of that increasing egalitarianism has been the economic disempowerment of Black and minority ethnic communities in this country. And the Black Lives Matter protests that took place during the pandemic were entirely understandable. Again, you know, if you live where I live, during the heart of lockdown, you could see the people who were deemed to be essential workers and who were going off to work in the morning despite the lockdown. And you knew they were coming from multi-generational and multi-occupancy households. I know it because I know them. They're my neighbors. And they were almost exclusively from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So there is a real tangible problem of economic disadvantage in these communities. What they're offered by the majority white community is a lot of agonizing and posting black squares on social media. And frankly, I think it's offensive. And I think virtue signaling is, you know, if I were dictator, I'd probably ban it because it runs so counter to the reality of compassion. The reality of compassion is that it always wears a face. The reality of compassion is that it is, you know, in the immortal words of Martin Buber, the Jewish mystic philosopher, it's always a case of I, thou. It's not a case of I, it. And virtue signaling from behind a screen is always a case of objectification and I, it. Now, I said I was going to come at this from a slightly odd angle, and I needed to preface what I was going to say with considerable disclaimers. It's very difficult for people to hear this. Liberalism is an encompassing ideology, and it's prophylactic. And under the category liberal, if you're thinking in terms of a right-left spectrum, I would include everybody pretty much in a mainstream political party who's a representative in the current parliament. It's a wide spectrum, the liberal, and it, at root, it believes wholeheartedly still in this idea of progress, twofold progress, like a caduceus, like the symbol of the Hippocratic profession that so dominate us and who we look to so much, and whose problems coping with the current pandemic are so much evident of our general social and cultural dis-ease as much as they are of the pesky COVID-19 virus. And the thing to note about this prophylactic of this wide spectrum of liberalism is the belief that progress, technological progress, growth of the economy can go benevolently hand in hand with social progress, and really, let's be blunt, with moral progress, is, I believe, at root erroneous. It's just not, simply not true. And, you know, Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor, famously wrote a book recently called The Better Angels of Ourselves, arguing on a statistical basis that things have indeed, in the famous D Ream song lyric that formed the rallying call for New Labour in the 1997 election, that things really have only got better in that way. But I don't think they have. I don't see that they have. I think that what the pandemic has exposed, quite worryingly, is an underlying and widening gap in terms of access to services, in terms of economic provision. And I'm sure that the recession that's coming will precipitate a lot of people into that very gap. I say all this because I want to say something that people are going to find distressing. I do not believe that a true multiculture exists or can exist. I believe it to be a contradiction in terms. I believe it's a mistake and an understanding. That doesn't mean that I don't hope that people from different cultures can live together peacefully. It doesn't mean that I don't have that aspiration myself, but nonetheless, I think it is fundamentally a contradiction in terms. Culture is a vector. It is a means of carrying practices, rituals, objects, customs, and most particularly the values that are enshrined in all of that forward into the future. That is what culture is. It isn't just something we do now, it's something we do now with the intention of implicating the future in it. And it's something we do now because we believe it has been transmitted to us from the past. The values of the several cultures that currently inhabit Britain can be highly incompatible. The values of Orthodox people of religious faith are quite radically different to those of secular liberals. And yet, secular liberals are often those who most loudly trumpet the idea of inclusiveness. I'm sorry, they're acting in bad faith. You know, I put it in an article I've just written on the anti-Semitism crisis for Prospect magazine for the December issue. I put it like this: you can be in the Great British Bake Off tent if you're wearing a hijab, but you can't be in there in full niqab. The assimilation that is proposed in our culture insists that your cultural markers become just that. They become a question of your different cuisine, or that you dress a little bit differently, or that you have slightly different festivals. They are no longer the principal vector that carries your unique values forward. So, you know, the big argument in the 1970s, both in the United States and here in Britain, was, do we have a melting pot or a salad bowl? Okay. I would say that the salad bowl always had a melting pot underneath it. The salad, if you like, was always bound to wilt to some extent, or else you're going to have open division. And, you know, in the article, not, it's perhaps a bit invidious to quote oneself, but in the article I wrote for Prospect, I said that, you know, actually, some of the rage directed perhaps towards the Jews in this country is precisely because the Jews have assimilated. And in many cases, assimilated so much that we've become indistinguishable from the host population. And I think that produces anxiety and anger on all sides. We've become, you know, uncanny, unheimlichkeit. We are the thing that's at home that is most unhomely in that sense. So we have a problem here if we believe somehow that we can craft a society in which it's possible for different people with quite radically different value systems to sign up to the same aspirational future. And indeed, that seems to be the case. We don't have anything like Coventry Cathedral being built. We don't have anything like the large-scale reconstruction. Well, actually, you know, the Blitz wasn't that bad. Coventry was a bit of an exception. The large-scale demolition and reconstruction of British city centres in the post-war period. What we have instead is vast white elephant schemes like HS2 and Crossrail. Build the roads and the cars will come. These schemes are necessarily factored on a massive expansion of an economy that depends for its very lifeblood on the exploitation of now scarce natural resources, the extraction of which contributes further to the climate emergency. So arguably, instead of being, you know, bearing in mind that the activators of the post-war period knew nothing of this, instead of being in the good faith of both right and left to build a more egalitarian and socially progressive culture after the war, our schemes are hardly ever seen in that light. And, you know, I don't want to kind of bite the hand that feeds me or be disrespectful to the people who've organized Rising itself as a forum, or particularly to my introductor, Chenine. But it seems to me that the entire industry of saying that one's in charge of culture or responsible for culture or building cultural projects is a sign of the commoditization of culture, just as much as compulsive Netflix and Amazon streaming, the staggering prices paid to models or Hollywood actors, and all of the phenomena that we see around us, which is a mass culture that has been factored into a commodity so that people can buy it and what? Be entertained? Certainly not feel a necessary identification with this vector of values carrying forward into the future. So, what do I think is causing it? I think what's causing it is that there is not an anthropic solution to anthropic climate change. Let's just refresh ourselves for a minute at exactly what the extent of this problem is. Remember, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change represents 99% of the climate scientists in the world. There is no dissenting opinion from within the scientific community. And the consensus is that we are already in a period where we're developing feedback loops leading to runaway climate change. The evidence is all around us. You know, I suspect I'm mostly addressing people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Those of us in the older 2 decades have seen it happen in our adult lifetime. We've actually seen it happen. We've gone from being a country that almost always had 3 weeks with below zero temperatures in the winter to one that emphatically doesn't. We've gone to being a culture where once in 100 years episodes of flooding happen almost every year. And we can look at the rest of the world. We can look at the fire nados that are sweeping up and down the Pacific seaboard of America or striking Australian cities. We can look to the islands in the Pacific or the Maldives that are beginning to suffer from rising sea levels. The paper that interested me most in relation to the climate emergency was actually one written by a man called Jem Bendell, who is involved with Extinction Rebellion. It gained a good deal of prominence a couple of years ago, and it's called Deep Adaptation. Bendell's argument is twofold. One is peer-reviewed science is lagging behind the indicators of the climate emergency, and I think that's a relatively uncontentious argument. You don't need to kind of go to the Guardian's special environmental section every day to have that confirmed. We know it's the case. His other argument, I think, is more interesting and more important in terms of how we view our culture going forward. And that is the massive amount of denial that exists in our society in respect of the climate emergency. as Bendel puts it, he did a meta-analysis of papers, academic papers published in the environmental sciences. And that's kind of all the way across the environmental sciences, from people who are drilling deep ice cores in the Greenland ice cap and are doing that kind of painstaking analysis, to people who are working on, touchy-feely sustainability agendas for large corporates. He looked at this, he did this meta-analysis of all of the papers, and he found only 2 papers in all of the ones he analyzed that even alluded to the possibility of near-term social collapse as a function of the climate emergency. When you find denial of that order, i.e. denial of the very possibility of near-term social collapse, I think you have to say to yourself, just as the writer Elias Canetti did in respect of crowds, he said, when I see a crowd of people running one way, I go in the other direction. You have to say to yourself, this is a herd mentality. This is an inability to see what's happening. And in a sense, to return to the beginning of my remarks on this topic, people often wonder how it was that so many of the million Jews who were in Germany prior to Hitler's accession to power in 1936 remained there, 33, remained there and waited, as it were, to be scooped up by the Holocaust. And I think the answer is right in front of your eyes, because we are those people. We are the people who are going to sit here and be enveloped by an environmental apocalypse of some kind or other. And my personal view is that the current pandemic is an outlier of this. It's arisen, as a lot of new zoonotic illnesses do, because of our encroachment, further encroachment in this, the age of the Anthropocene, the age when incontrovertibly humans are able to alter the global environment. This is a disease that is a function of that process, of this human incursion on the formerly dominant natural world. And I think the deformations that we're experiencing in our culture at the moment are what I call pressure ridges. You can think of our entire society and culture as being an outgrowth of our discovery of the way to harness the potential energy of fossil fuels. The Industrial Revolution is logically prior to the European Enlightenment. The European Enlightenment, in my view, is an ideological ex post facto justification, or if you like, of the enormous new technological powers gifted by the exploitation of fossil fuels. So, we've been involved in our own apotheosis from day one. What does that tell you about humans? Monkey see, monkey do. We are not going to pull out of this in time. And indeed, we haven't pulled out of this in time. I do not believe there is any possible anthropic solution to anthropic climate change. I think it's very, very unlikely. I'll be amazed if we pull it off. Look at the news. Look at the way that the news surrounding the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19. I went out this morning, and I swear to you, there were 5 times as many cars on the road as yesterday, and this during the pandemic lockdown. I think people sat at home last night and looked at the news and thought, because they were being told it's the top line of the news, the pandemic's over, back to work. The key word, the toxin that awakes us again and again from our quotidian slumbers is hope. We cannot live without hope. We must have hope. Hope is an ideological constraint of liberalism. No progress, no hope. And what we've experienced during the pandemic is just the first of a series of what we might call technological falls. And that's why it's been so shocking to us. In fact, as people are keen to point out, and I don't mean this in some kind of weird QAnon, the virus isn't real way at all. I'm in the shield category myself. I've been very isolated this year. I have several underlying health conditions I know fine well, and my younger children were orphaned last year. so I really don't want to die. I know fine well it's a real phenomenon, but it's nonetheless, I was very struck, for example, by a report from a BBC correspondent in Idlib in northern Syria a few weeks ago. The first thing the correspondent, who presumably might not have been in country that long, said, nobody here is wearing a mask. Well, of course, nobody in Idlib is wearing a mask. Your chances of dying of some other infectious disease, or indeed, war, are far greater in Idlib than they are of dying of COVID-19. And people calibrate all the time. We're not idiots. We calibrate risk all the time. Except right here in Britain, our ideology of liberalism and our faith in socialized medicine, which sets itself up not simply as promising treatment irrespective of who you are on demand, but implicitly any treatment, has created a hope that is a demand for ever better medical technology. And that is why I think the inability to deal with the pandemic has shocked us so profoundly. But this is just one of many shocks. The cultural fracturing, the internecine war between liberals. We all sense, if we're not in denial, we shove it down and repress it, that the future for this kind of ever expansive, resource exploitative economy and culture has already hit the buffers. And it is that shock of hitting into the buffers that is creating what I call pressure ridges. It's perhaps an unfortunate analogy or image when talking in terms of the climate emergency, but I think, again, I used to love polar and Antarctic exploration. Well, polar exploration, I always found it extraordinary and haunting, like visiting other planets, to read the accounts of the people who visited these incredibly frigid places and wild places for the first time. And in the Arctic or the Antarctic, or in the past, when an ice sheet hits a bit of land, it starts to ruck up like a carpet. We're living in that rucking up. It's hit in the future, if we translate space into time. The ice flow has already hit the land, and behind it, here we are, a little way back in the past, confused. We seem to have lost our footing in our culture, and we can't quite understand why. Everybody's just as nice as they always were. Everybody's just as progressive as they always were, if not more so. Everybody seems to have the aspiration to be nice to their neighbors. The top line of our culture is one of more inclusiveness. I grew up in the 1970s, and lots of other people 60s and 70s, when the N-word was spoken on television. There was something called the Black and White Minstrels Show. In my class at school, which was a third recent immigrants, the children of recent immigrants from East Africa, from Asian families who'd left East Africa, the word Paki was regularly deployed as an epithet, not least by the boys themselves. So this was a culture in which the top line was one of a kind of assumed racial hierarchy imported from the old British Empire. Nowadays, things on the top line would appear to be much better, much, much better. But the underlying situation is arguably worse, in fact. So what does that tell us about ourselves? I would argue that that's the direct concomitant of the kind of, posting a black square on Instagram in support of Black Lives Matter. That's the gulf that represents our bad faith. Okay, fine, Will. You're really good at making us feel miserable and unhappy and saying that everything's grim and desperate. And you've just told us that the world's coming to an end. So why would we expect things to be better at a cultural or a social level? You're not going to leave us here like that. And the answer is no, I'm not. Because you may see that I'm not actually that unhappy a person. I wouldn't say I'm exactly a glass half full person, but nor am I somebody who gets up in the morning. For example, I'm not suffering from depression. Arguably, that's because I've already been through my grief process in relation to the idea of this progressive society. I've already made my peace with the idea that we're not marching arm in arm towards some new secular Jerusalem. And I must just say at this point, I'd like to reserve a space here for people of religious faith, because in a way, I'm not speaking to you. I have absolute respect for people who believe in a salvation and a grace that is not of this world. Okay, a profound respect. And you're kind of exempt from all of this because you never placed your faith in God's city being built on earth. You always placed your faith in God's city being in heaven. And particularly if you're a serious, belong to one of the revealed religions, to Islam or to Judaism or to Christianity, that's always been the case. And, you get on with that. That's fine. For those of us who can't believe in that way, we have a different process to go through. But I think that when we accept the reality of the situation, there is a curious liberation that occurs at that point. We're liberated back into what I began talking about, that compassion always bears an individual face. It always is about an I-thou interaction. It's always direct. If you direct your compassion towards individuals, and the great American urbanist Jane Jacobs, who probably wouldn't have liked the redevelopment of Coventry immediately after the Second World War, her lifelong battle was with an urban activator called Robert Moses in New York. But Jane Jacobs had this great phrase, make only vital little plans. And I think our problem as a society, oddly enough, comes from believing that if we make vital big plans, they will render unnecessary vital little plans. If we have social security, we don't need to be compassionate towards our neighbors who are poorer than us. If we build lots of public housing, we don't need to think about housing or whatever it is. Never before have we been confronted more starkly with our powerlessness in a major way. Really, I would argue, since the 6th of August 1945, when the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and 150,000 men, women, and children, mostly non-combatants, were evaporated in an instant, in less than a second. I think all of humanity has lived under this terrible double bind since then, which has only exacerbated our intrinsically divided nature. And I think that what we require to face the predicament we're in is to make only vital little plans and to practice compassion at an individual level. And the relief, I think, that might be experienced if we scaled that up would be considerable. Because, Marx said, and here at least I do agree with him, history is made by the great mass of individuals. And if as individuals we can be compassionate, if as individuals we can make our main efforts in these vital little plans rather than the airy abstractions of virtue signaling or of signing up to major ideological programs that promise to deliver, to build heaven on earth, then I think we may be in with a chance of making some of what's about to happen bearable. And I think an attitude like that will throw a greater light on the current culture wars, because I think that the current culture wars are being fought. I think people outside of it might argue, why is it necessary to, for example, eviscerate J.K. Rowling, the author, because she seems to be a trans-exclusionary feminist, if not radical feminist. Whence comes the anger and the violence of this conflict? And the answer is, the anger and the violence of this conflict comes from all parties in their heart of hearts, knowing that there's no resolution to it, that their ideology is internally contradictory in that respect. Liberalism valorizes individual choice, but only offers individual choice in the form of consumption and commodification. It cannot offer any kind of organic or social existence. And in fact, it's inherently destructive of cultural vectors. Anyway, that's sort of me. That's what I said. I'm holding my my 400,000-year-old Neolithic hand axe, which was found in Farnham and Surrey, made by a Homo heidelbergensis. It's exactly the same size as a modern smartphone, and it keeps me connected at all times with the idea of culture.
Thank you so much, Will. Wow, there's so many themes and discussion points in your presentation today. I think it's very valid also, by the way, what you're saying about culture, cultural leadership, something that we're really trying to explore, change, test, trial in our city of culture. So hopefully you can come back and see how we get on.
Not come back.
Come, that's true. You're not here, are you?
I've not been yet.
So listen, we've got a little bit of time. We've got about half an hour or so for a bit of a Q&A. I've got a few starting points, I suppose. I really love what you were saying about vital little plans versus those kind of big plans that make the little ones irrelevant sometimes. And it's something we're looking at with City of Culture, and how do we kind of really invest in that kind of grassroots revolution that's going on all over the UK, not just in Coventry, rather than being kind of heads turned by the big stuff. The big art, the big culture, and how do we invest in the little? It's something that we're really trying hard to look at. And I suppose it comes back to questions of what is culture and cultural value. And I just wanted to ask you, you've talked a lot about multiculturalism, obviously, today, and your thoughts on that, which, you know, very much of what you say, I absolutely agree with. I just wonder about the war on culture that's being impacted by issues like poverty, like mental health, homelessness, some of those other big issues in our society that create division as well, or create that kind of inability for people to participate in the debate or the discussion. And I wonder where that sits in your thinking around the culture wars, Will.
Well, I mean, I think I did sort of address this with my remarks about Coventry in the post-war period. I mean, it does seem to me that when you have a unitary culture, it's free to look purely at the question of economic inclusiveness. And all of the things you highlight are about economic disadvantage and about an inegalitarian society. Our problem is, you know, and actually, you know, bless him, Tony Blair is absolutely, far more than Thatcher, is the absolute personification of this. Estimated net wealth now in the many, many tens of millions. What's that about? You remember his consigliere, Peter Mandelson, said, we're seriously comfortable with people being seriously rich, not least himself, of course. The Blair regime, which I suspect for you as well, was the regime of your majority, in a sense, when we were doing most of our work and were probably most relevant, was exactly that kind of have-it-all regime, where it pretended that you could have a culture that was inclusive while being paid for by an economy that was effectively divisive. And you can't actually, trickle-down economics don't work. You know, if you want a more egalitarian society, you've got to redistribute. If you want a more egalitarian society, you've got to tax. There's no smoke and mirrors that will make rich people give up their money. Yeah, they'll give it up for philanthropy. They'll give it up for charity. But you know who gives most money to charity? The poor, every time. And you know why the poor give, and the poor give money to charities that work, usually. They're ground level charities, because what the poor know that the rich probably never knew, but if they ever knew it, they certainly forget it, is nobody wants to be in receipt of charity. And so I think, I hate to say it, I think this is an incompatible objective. You can say, if you cannot get distracted by the issue of trying to preserve in, as it were, a kind of sequestrated form, a set of cultural values that are non-mainstream. Yeah, you can't do that at the same time as raising all boats with a rising tide. It's one or t'other that you have to concentrate on. And I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. And unfortunately, the objective of respecting people's culture, I think, has often been used in this society by main, knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing.
Yeah. So can I ask you, just as a follow-on, if we can agree that multiculturalism was a great concept and vision, but just hasn't been seen to work anywhere, probably. I'm a Zoroastrian, and we've been migrants for all of our lives, moving around the world, looking for that kind of great multiculturalism place. But I wonder whether in recent times we've seen a shift, or we might be seeing a shift towards a different type of system for our society. And do you think that's possible, that we might move away from capitalism? It feels like on the ground we're moving away from capitalism, in terms of that kind of grassroots community. And if we moved away from it, could multiculturalism then prosper more? If the systemic change of our society could happen.
Oh, I don't know. Are we? Who are we giving money to now through Zoom?
True.
The most aggressive and expansionist capitalist economy in the world, China. Who are we? When we kick off this evening, I'm going to I have a sad and pathetic weakness, as does my partner, for James Bond films. We're going to watch a multi-billion-dollar film franchise, the latest movie of which has been held back from the cinemas because it couldn't possibly earn out during the pandemic. And indeed, these giant film franchises are in such a pernicious lockstep with the very medium itself that the failure to release the latest James Bond film has imperiled the entire cinema distribution system in this country. That doesn't sound like an alternative system to capitalism to me. I think, again, we're duping ourselves. And I'm afraid to say, I think the move to increased virtuality during the lockdown, capitalism loves. Capitalism loves it. Remember, the key philosopher of capitalism, of capitalist production, isn't, Hayek, or, it isn't Adam Smith. It's Edward Taylor, the founder of time and motion studies, of Taylorization, who made production efficient. And, one of the things the web has demonstrably failed to do, and I would argue this is another of those pressure ridges, is increase productivity. Now, whether that's because too many people are playing Candy Crush instead of doing their work, or more worryingly, it's because our jobs weren't really that economically productive in the first place, and we've just transliterated them to a virtual level, I don't know. But what I do know, and I say this as somebody who's in the university system at the moment, and remember that all of our universities have been reconfigured as corporations within the last 10 years, run on debt within a capitalist system, is that it will enable the powers that be, whoever they may be, to keep a much tighter eye on whether we're actually working and what we're actually doing. We have actually initiated our own panopticon, our own all-seeing prison in which we sit all the time regarding each other. I think that the web-based and virtualized working system is a real problem, actually. It's a real problem. I think in terms of our culture, it's a real problem. Many people will be saying, well, I wouldn't have got through the pandemic without Joe Wicks's morning workout. I wouldn't have got through the pandemic without being able to connect with people over Zoom. I'm sorry, human societies are not, they're the first minatory account of the impact of virtualization is E.M. Forster's great story, The Machine Stops, which he wrote in 1912, foreseeing a future in which people are so screen-based that when the screen breaks down, they basically lose their compass altogether. He was prescient. We're now in that situation, and I'm not frightened of people calling me a Luddite. I don't care, because I honestly don't think this is going to last for that long. I don't think humans, we like to groom each other. We're like all the other apes. We like to touch each other. We like to be each other. We like to feel each other's breath in our faces, even people we don't like. We are social animals in that sense, and this is no substitute for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Will. Listen, there's a few questions coming through, so I should probably go to my screen and start to run through them with you. The first one is from Hudri, who actually shared this with us about half an hour ago, so probably when you were still speaking, and wanted to talk about convergent identity. And how can we make that happen without raising any conflict among diverse identities?
You can't. Of course, you're going to be. If an identity is rooted in a system of values and people cleave to those values, then there are going to be conflicts between values. Values are, how we standardize and order experience, how we mediate our interactions with other people. And I'm sorry, you can be tolerant of people in the public sphere, and we should be tolerant. And I'm sure everybody, this is, I scarcely imagine people attending the Rising Global Peace Forum are focused on being intolerant in the public sphere. I think we're all focused on that. But I think the point I wanted to make was tolerance is not agreement, it's not consensus, and it isn't even convergence. It's actually accepting that the values are not your values, but allowing them to exist. And we seem to have a real problem with that psychologically. And as I say, that's rooted in our own ideology, which is confused and self-contradictory. It's an ideology that has its roots in racism and yet now wants to proclaim itself an inherently anti-racist ideology. So that kind of conflict and bad faith is not going to help us. I don't do ideology. That's not my thing. I don't think there's some grand plan that will enable us to converge or diverge, or what there is. I'm with de Tocqueville on this. The law exists to restrain our worst impulses, not encourage our best. And, since the BLM protests, a lot of people, interestingly, I can't remember her name, interestingly, a Black British academic in Wales raised this as well in a piece in the liberal house journal, The Guardian. And she seemed to be speaking quite unselfconsciously about how tolerant the Roman Empire was in racial terms, that there were black Roman generals. She completely neglected to mention that it was a slave society. So, I mean, the world is a wild and strange and marvelous place. And one size has never fitted all. No. And it's, the other example we can think of a society that was oddly tolerant was fin de siècle Austro-Hungarian Empire before the First World War. It was an empire. It wasn't a democracy, So it's kind of confusing for us to take that on board, because we're in that progressive liberal tradition where we want our ideology to lead us there, but it's not going to. So all I would say in answer to that is it's back to compassion is individual. It's not collective. When you go to help somebody who's been knocked down in the street, you don't ask them whether they believe in God or not, or whether they believe that gay marriage is acceptable. You just help them, okay? Yeah. And ditto, if you want to help people in the future, I think the last time I gave to, for example, international charity was after the Haiti disaster, and I gave quite a lot of money after the Haiti disaster. There seemed a pressing need, a good case was being made for it. And of course, I discovered afterwards that the relief operation in Haiti was kind of hopelessly mismanaged, corrupt, involved some of the worst abuses. And I thought, it's back to Jane Jacobs, it's back to the vital little plan.
Yeah. Thank you, Will. I'm going to move on to Luca Di Bianchi, who asks, would you say there is a stronger sense of cultural community in some areas of the UK than others? And do economic factors impact this?
I think there are holdouts and readouts. There are cultures within cultures. You know, in the northern cities, for example, there are British Asian communities that are extremely close and tight and have been for multiple generations there. They're a different kind of culture. They're a hybridized culture. You know, they're not something that we necessarily have a huge amount of access to ourselves, but they're there. I'm a bit concerned because Chenine, there you are, you're back on. You'd frozen for a moment. I suddenly worried about my internet connection. You know, or you get holdouts like Liverpool that has a very strong sense of itself as culturally unique and distinct. And, you know, we've seen that throughout the pandemic, and we've seen the conflict between the government and the northern cities, which would seem to imply more cultural unity in the north. But you know what? I think the strength of regional or minority cultures in Britain now is probably as nothing compared to what it was 50 years ago or 60 years ago. Just to give you a little slice of that, there's a marvelous book by a writer called John Hillaby. I'm trying to remember the title, but basically he walks the length of Britain. He does it in the early 60s. One of the first pubs he goes into for a drink in Cornwall, he cannot understand the people talking in the bar. They are talking in such strong Cornish dialect. It's not English. It's a dialect of English, and he doesn't understand it. And the thing is that that's then replicated throughout his walk. Moving at ground level, moving slowly, he sees this rich palimpsest of cultures overlaying cultures. The thing is, it was all gone within a few years, really. And it was television what done it. It's the dreaded screen as well. I'm sorry, you know, culture is a practice. If we spend most of our time sitting on our asses watching Hollywood streamed blockbusters, then we're not making corn dollies. We're not going to Evensong. We're not making lights for Diwali. We're not, you know, whatever it is that is a cultural practice that would involve us with other people, we're clearly not doing it, you know. And again, I would finger Blair. He is my bête noire, I have to say. You know, it was Blair, you know, my friend, the writer Martin Amis, spent a week with him once, and I said to him afterwards, what was he like being someone? And Martin said, I'll tell you one thing, he's not a reader, you know. And Blair, you know, and his culture, you remember the famous meeting with Gordon Brown at Granita, the trendy restaurant in Islington. It was a culture that you could, you know, the idea under Blairism was you could eat culture. You didn't have to read it. You certainly didn't have to do it. You know, cultural consumption really came into its own. It was kind of Jamie's eat Italian rather than, you know, be Italian. And I'm sorry, I think we're still there. And in many ways, I think the anxiety, the angst, and the rage about culture is because some minority communities here feel their culture being eroded by assimilation. You know, it's not really about the British white majority feeling their culture assailed. I'm sorry, white majority, you did it to yourselves. Nobody from outside Britain sat there watching all that television, talking in an estuarine accent, eating the same food, never walking in the countryside. You know, it isn't people from South Asia or people from the Caribbean who stopped you going to church or stopped you, you know, and I'm sorry, you know, white British majority, you pay lip service to your cultural shibboleths. You pay lip service to it. You clap the NHS, you put on a little bit of paper in November. That's not culture. You know, one of the things I found most anti-cultural in recent years was that massive display of poppies in the Tower of London, which they did. I think it was for the 100th anniversary of the armistice.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys, that ain't culture.
Yeah. And can I ask you a quick question before I move on to the next one? just, I suppose it's the role of heritage and history. And I know that you've talked in one of your articles about the colonization of our heritage and history, and how it kind of, you know, it kind of affects culture, and sometimes it affects it in a good way. And obviously, you know, with all the work we're doing in Coventry, we're rooted in where people in the city have come from. But it feels like sometimes people hold on to that in the absence of anything else,
Hold on to
or in
the
the absence
past.
of it being able to look forwards, or engage with what's around them now. What are your
Well, I mean, I agree, but I mean that's because we're doomed. You know, you don't have to be that weird character in Dad's Army to come out with that line. I think we're doomed in a very particular way. Don't get me wrong. I don't think the world's going to come to an end. I don't think society's over. I don't think, you know, but I think this pandemic is the first. It's the beginning of the end of the second great age of globalization, and I'm sure what you'll discuss a lot in the forum going forward, because I don't imagine that anybody's, you know, who's participating is particularly starry-eyed about the immediate future, is how do we, as people, and I would include myself in this, who are progressive in a real sense, in other words, are progressive in terms of those vital little plans, not necessarily the great big ones, how do we adapt to that? How do we deal with this increasing balkanization, the rise of nationalism, the rise of intolerance, Brexit, you know, the drawbridge being pulled up. You know, if I believed that there were a strong, rooted cultural tradition in Britain that was progressive in that sense, that was egalitarian, socially inclusive, I wouldn't have any trouble with being a kind of retro fanatic of the worst kind. I'd be, you know, I'd go Morris dancing tomorrow if I thought that that's what it enshrined, but it doesn't. That's the problem. It's mostly a kind of hobbyist's interest and obsession with bloodlines, which again is a function of a loss of cultural identity, not an actualization of it. It's a commoditization of the heritage industry. Look at, you know, I interviewed Simon Thurley a few years ago when he was running English Heritage. And at that time, you know, his major concern running English Heritage was what to do about Stonehenge and a handful of other major sites because they were a cash cow. You know, and on the weird little trundling road train, they take you on from the visitor centre up to the stones now, which incidentally, people, you completely can avoid by walking in from the northeast, and you can get right up to the stones for nothing. I was sat next to an elderly man from Virginia in the States, and I said, what he'd done was they'd arrived on the cruise ship to Southampton, got in the coach, gone to Salisbury Cathedral, gone to Stonehenge, and then they were leaving. And you know, that's our culture. Our culture is devoted to getting the man from Virginia to.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think also the more you try to create more equity, the more you create the divide, because actually people that have had it good for so long feel that the feel bereft in some ways. Yeah, I think it's right. I'm going to move on to the next question. So I've got a question here from Dave Hirons, and he asks, what does the 400,000-year-old axe head transmit to you in terms of cultural values if it was created to be used as a weapon rather than a tool?
It's indisputably a tool. It is not a weapon. It's a rubbish weapon. You know, think about it. You know, I hold to Marshall McLuhan, the great cultural theorist's view of what technology is. And, you know, McLuhan says technology is action at a distance. You know, all weapons involve a fulcrum, even if the arm is the fulcrum. Yeah. And so they're going to be an extension of the arm. This only extends about 2 inches beyond my hand. And it's not a throwing weapon either. So if it's not an extending tool and it's not a projectile tool, then it's not a weapon, because it's not going to create action at a distance in that way. It's a scraping tool for taking meat off skin. It's a chipping tool for cutting other chert. It's a tool in that sense. And the thing I take from the hand axe is its haptic quality. It's felt, it's in the hand, it's ergonomic. You can't really see on the camera, but my fingers fit neatly into it. It was made by Homo heidelbergensis, a cousin of the Neanderthal, but I'm a big guy, and obviously they had big hands. And what it does is it connects me with the idea that what humans do is they try and effect action at a distance. We are tool using people. And the trouble is that we become completely enthralled to these technologies, and we view them, and this is the key point, as value neutral. So in a way, the question's right. It could be a weapon or it could be a tool. It could potentially be a weapon, okay? And that's the way we think about tools. And I don't really think that technology is value neutral. I think the minute you start to effect action at a distance, you are making a choice that you're in terms of your values. You're going to do something that you want or something that somebody else doesn't want or whatever it is. And the other problem with technology, and this is that we regard it as standing reserve. We think that when we're not using a technology, it's not doing anything. It's just inert. And that's why, you know, another of my great bête noirs, you walk down any suburban street in this country and there are thousands, if not millions of pounds of resources just sitting there in the road called parked cars. An extraordinary profligacy. That is not value neutral either. You know, technology is not a standing reserve, as we know now from the climate emergency. All those cars sitting around is what's done it to us. Not driving them even, just sitting them around, little parked sheds.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to just, as you've talked about climate emergency, I'm just going to go on to a question from Jessica Northey. She says, vital little plans are so important, yet we also need big plans to adapt and mitigate to the potentially devastating impacts of the climate crisis. Are the sum of many individual activists on climate now having an impact at a higher level in the UK? And do you think there's a meaningful shift at the top now as a result of grassroots activism?
No. It's the simple answer. You have to bear in mind that half of the greenhouse gases ever emitted by humans, by anthropic activities, have been emitted since Kyoto in 1997. So no, that's the kind of creature we are, I'm afraid. It's too late and it's not going to work. We have runaway feedback loops on climate change happening right now. So the science tells us, and it is neutral, remember, it's not value laden. It tells us that we will have an ice-free year at the Arctic sometime between now and 2050. That's only 30 years, and it could be next year. When that happens, the loss of albedo, of the reflective quality of the ice, it's estimated will be sufficient to add a further 25% of emissions, equivalent to a further 25% of all the emissions ever emitted in a single year. That could really be pretty apocalyptic in terms of its impact. So I'm sorry, and I'm going to be a little bit rude here, but to me, when I look at Extinction Rebellion floats, and I look at all of those lovely young people wearing the same kind of baggy drawstring trousers we were wearing in the Cyclades in 1977, and I think, there goes the ship of fools.
Yeah. So do you think, I suppose that there's a way, I suppose if we show compassion at that individual level, what can we do as individuals if we want to make those kind of little plans that have the big impact? What is it that we can do as individuals to move past the system we're in and to make things better, I suppose?
I'm glad you asked, because, you know, I mean, I was sort of, in a way said, you know, I'm down on hope. I don't think hope gets you far. Hope is an area of abstraction. What we have is now, okay? What can you do? You might think that I'd say, well, there's no point in, for example, you know, decreasing your carbon footprint. I'm not going to say that. I'm heavily in favor of decreasing your carbon footprint because the same sort of discipline in relation to resource consumption and in relation to, you know, moving more lightly on the surface of the earth will be required in the parlous circumstances we're going to move into that we can't ameliorate, as would be required to effect amelioration. So yeah, all of that stuff is good. I haven't owned a car for 10 or 12 years. I cut my flights. Well, I stopped flying altogether for 4 years, and then I cut my flights to a couple a year. There's a part of me that was not unhappy at realizing with the pandemic that it was unlikely that I'd fly again, even though, of course, there are places I'd like to go to just like anyone else. But what I would say is remember that thing about, you know, it really was all those city breaks that have killed us. It really was. It was treating other cities not culturally, but as if they were commodities. You know, you used to have those conversations with people in the 2000s when it really took off, that mass flying. They'd say things like, "Oh, I've done Split. I'm doing Prague next week," as if it were, you know, it's like the bucket list.
Yeah.
That's another sign of the relentless commoditization of people's lives. Who wants to think of their life in terms of that as a series of tick boxes? So yeah, I think there's lots. The vital little plan is right now. Do that stuff. Cycle, walk. Don't spend so much time on screens. Talk to your neighbor. You know, do that stuff. Get involved with culture at the grassroots level. If you see people doing something and it chimes with you and you see it as an arena in which you can be creative, participatory and cooperative, then do it. You know.
Thanks, Will. I've got two more questions from you for you. So the first one is from James Morgan, and he wants to talk about Brexit. And he says, do you think it's because there's a sense of cultural difference in the UK compared to the rest of mainland Europe? Is that the reason for Brexit?
I think it's been triggered by the fact that quite a lot of people felt. I think I'm a Brexit agnostic. It's a bit like God. You know, when I wrote a long piece for the New European last year in the run up to when we were meant to leave, if you remember, and you know, I went through the Red Wall constituencies and spoke to people there and spoke to working class people, black, British, Asian, white, of all stripes, who had voted to leave. And they'd voted to leave because they saw the hypocrisy and bad faith of, and I'm sorry, it does exist, of the metropolitan liberal elite. You don't just have to be a crazed racist right winger like Rod Liddle to believe in that. Yeah. There is a metropolitan liberal elite, and I'm sorry, it has acted in bad faith. It's sold poorer working class people the idea again that, you know, this inclusive culture will necessarily improve their economic and social situation, and it didn't. So I think that's what won the vote, though it was very, very marginal, was those people. What culture they identified with or their belief in, I think, was actually quite secondary to the annoyance at being talked to. In other words, I think it brought back a kind of culture as resentment in that way. But I don't think it necessarily brought back culture in a positive sense. And that's, of course, the great worry. You know, look what's happened under the pandemic. I'm sorry to be a bit, you know, we could have solved the problem in education over the summer easily. Easily. If we were a society that believed in ourselves, we would have set up those summer schools, outdoor classes, field trips. You know, we taught for the test for so long, we commoditized for so long that when we got rid of the tests, nobody did any studying. And everybody went, oh God, how did that happen? Well, we've been telling our children for decades now that all they had to do was to pass the test. We've been telling them for ages now that all they needed to do was to go to university and get a potato printed degree certificate and that would ensure that they'd be hoiked into the middle class. And it was a lie. It meant nothing. And we've been exposed in that way.
Thanks, Will. One final, well, there was one other little bit that came on with that question, but I'll ask you that at the end because it's a fun bit. One question from Fred Mudai, and he says, what's your view on Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations concept? Do you think terrorism, wars and conflicts are a manifestation of this concept and therefore inevitable?
I honestly don't even think our civilization is strong enough to clash with any other. You know, what led the invasion in Iraq, which is, you know, the post 9/11 wars, what led to them was, you know, irresponsible meddling and messing around in other countries' affairs with a view to financial profit. You know, it was the afterburn of a different clash of civilizations, the States and the Soviet Union, which led to the CIA funding Al Qaeda in the first place, which meant that Al Qaeda had enough money to finance the freelance outfit that bombed the Twin Towers. And that in turn led to these totally spurious and discreditable interventions by the West in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. Wholly, I mean, despicable. I would absolutely, you know, the literary work I spent 10 years on is all about this, about the pathological relationship between war, technology, and psychological denial. Not about some positive civilizational mission at all. The wars of the 20th century are sick wars. They're wars of a pathology, of a disease in action. They represent no kind of civilizational clash at all. The idea of conveying democracy through the barrel of a gun to societies like Iraq was fatuous. It was so ridiculous. We could see it at the time, just as clearly as we could see fingerprints all over the dossier that was used to justify British engagement with it. So no, I completely dissent from that idea. You'd have to go back, in my view, to a pre-industrial era to talk meaningfully about the clash of civilizations. You know, what we have now are resource wars and different modes of extracting resources. You have the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, or you have the American "we're going to bomb your Belt and Road Initiative." You know, and that's about it, frankly.
So tell us, what direction do you see the future of culture heading in, of our culture? Thinking about the fact that we can see that multiculturalism as a concept has, you know, issues, challenges that will be very difficult to overcome for all the reasons you've set out. But how do you see it moving in the future?
I think the multicultural conflicts will probably get worse. I'm sorry. I just don't see how they're not going to, for all the reasons that we've adduced during this session. But I think culture itself, both in the sense of grassroots culture, in the sense of people getting together to articulate their values meaningfully through creative activities, is going to prosper.
Yeah.
Culture is what we do.
Yeah.
And actually, I think when the machine stops, we're going to have to do a great deal more of it. When we're not able to get the latest Bond film streamed to us, we'll start making our own films. You know, and I think, you know, the failure of globalization, which means that you know, it's less easy to commoditize, package, and sell culture and sell artworks, may paradoxically lead to an artistic renaissance. You know, we're funny creatures, and that's one of the, you know, again, back to fin de siècle Vienna, a society in collapse, but one of the most culturally vigorous ever. So, you know, nature gives and it takes away.
Thanks, Will. It's so interesting because we're doing a whole focus and approach through City of Culture around cultural democracy and what that looks like and how we shift power back to the people and the citizens, so it's their cultures that we're celebrating and promoting, rather than some kind of self-imposed notion of what culture should be. So I think you're absolutely right that it has to be back to the people for them to do those little acts or those big acts, but to kind of really think about what they want to celebrate or share or debate or discuss.
Crucially, you know, we back to the question of multiculturalism. They're not going to do it unless they believe they're articulating a viable value.
Yeah.
So they're not going to do it, you know, if they're told what the value is.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where the question is, isn't it? You know, how do we help them understand value in order to participate and share? And
well, that's the point, I'm afraid, at which I would say that your model is hopelessly mired in being patriarchal.
We'll see. Listen, we've come to the end. One final question that James Morgan wanted to ask is, what's your favorite James Bond film, seeing as that's where you might be tonight?
Ah, very good question. I have the honor, James, or the discredit to actually, I'm not a completist culturally at all, but for reasons that, you know, are for my eyes only, I have watched every single Bond film, and within living memory, which for the aging middle-aged person is about 2 or 3 years. and I can tell you that I think, notwithstanding the problems with Daniel Craig's portrayal of the character, that the reboot of the franchise, Casino Royale, I would argue, with Daniel Craig playing Bond and Eva Green and it's the finest Bond film. And the reason it's the finest Bond film is, you know, it's not to do with the massive, staggeringly high production values or the action sequences or anything else. It's because there's a love story at the center of it.
That's a really lovely note for us to finish on. I'm very happy with that. Thank you so much, Will. It's been a joy to have you with us and to have your provocations on multiculturalism, climate change and emergency, and all those other issues that we've discussed this afternoon. I just wanted to say to everyone else, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Please do give a virtual clap to Will. It's been so amazing to have you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Just to say that we are coming back at 4 o'clock, so please do rejoin us when Ezekiel Santana was coming to talk to us about peace in Rwanda. So finally, thanks again to Will. Thank you all.
Thank you, Wannel. Go in peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Will.